Hey community, welcome back. And if this is your first time here, I'm Dr. Blaire, a doc in clinical psychology. And on this channel, we discuss psychology, inspiration, social justice, and all topics in between. First things first, hit that subscribe and bell button. I need to see you back next week. And of course, stay tuned because we're going to continue our conversation around Black history, specifically the mental health of Black people. Keep watching. All right, so before we jump into it this time, again, trigger alert, we're talking about triggering information, and I just decided to kind of record all of this in one setting because it actually connects from what we talked about the previous week. And that was really focusing on the brokenness that was targeted around the Black family and how it has continued over centuries, over years, up until this day. And so today we need to dive into a conversation around mistrust toward one another or within the Black community. But first, again, this is triggering information, so I understand you may need to take pauses, come back, but I want you to make sure you're taking care of yourself. But it is designed for us to be in a place where we're thinking and processing and turning that into action and plans that we follow up on. And so without further ado, let's jump into it. And as I mentioned, I'm going to be glancing down on my notes here, there, not being rude, just need to make sure that I'm getting out all of my points. And so mistrust toward one another, of course, didn't start yesterday. It wasn't started when I was born. It wasn't started when my mother was born. It wasn't started when my grandparents were born. It wasn't started, it didn't happen overnight. And so I want to bring up a few things that actually I've seen historically has contributed to mistrust toward one another. And that is the persistent fight for one's safety. When you're in a consistent fight or persistent fight for your own safety, there's always this feel that I have to save me before I can save you. Now, historically, if you look at West Africa, Black people were collective people. They did things with one another. And so this individual perspective, which is actually a bit more deeply rooted in European culture, when that starts to get ushered in. But I think it was more so specifically when people felt like, well, I'm not safe, you're not safe, you can't help me, and I almost can't help myself. So a lack of safety. And that also then fought at the lack of respect toward one another, and always this constant fight of notoriety, to feel more important than the next person because I'm not treated important by anyone. And so the little bit of respect that I can get, the little bit of moments where I feel important, as I talked about in the previous week, where there was a lack of sense of belonging, which is one of those basic needs that comes on the hierarchy of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, that when you didn't have that, and if you could get a little ounce here or there, wherever you could, and if you could do whatever you needed to do, even if that meant sacrificing your integrity to feel like you had a little bit of belonging, to feel a little bit of importance, to get a little bit of respect or an illusion of respect, then I'll do that, even if that meant sacrificing my neighbor, or the person next to me, or the person I'm related to, or the person I just met. If they looked like me, it was okay. I was going to sacrifice it because it gave me a little bit of what I needed to fight another day. So sad to say, but it's true. And I'm not here to say it in a judgmental way of they shouldn't have done this and we shouldn't be doing these things. And yeah, we shouldn't. I mean, I think that goes without being said. But instead, from a perspective of really wanting us to think about, and this is being a trauma-informed perspective, think about it from a paradigm shift. You have to think about it from a perspective of all of the things that people endured, all of these things that have happened to people. This is what makes you do what you do. And so when we think about all these things that we've endured, it's like, yeah, it makes sense why you did that. It wasn't the best decision, but it's, again, goes back to what I said the previous week, making an emotionally based decision, which a lot of times got us a lot of poor behavior, essentially. And so we also saw a lot of, see a lack of consistent, keyword consistent, a lack of consistent support for Black-owned businesses. Now, conversations, and you probably heard conversations like this is why I don't support Black-owned businesses. They don't know how to run business. They move too slow. They always run out of product. The customer services support, like a laundry list of negative, constructive feedback that does not help the business to improve. Yet I see day in and day out, my people go to other people's businesses who represent other communities that who are essentially not Black, who treat us terribly. Yet there is not a long list of complaints given to them. In fact, the support doesn't stop. We continue to go back, and y'all, let me tell you, I'm having a hard time saying this out loud, knowing that this is going to go on a public platform on the interweb for anyone to hear. But it is true. I see it time and time again. I'm from Chicago. I see it here in Chicago. I've seen it in other areas. I've seen it in other cities and states that I've lived in, where we have gone to places where we are mistreated by other people, but yet we don't stand for it when we're mistreated by one another. And most of the time when we get mistreatment from one another in our own businesses, it is not intentional. It's a learning curve. If we have not had many models of positive, flourishing businesses, which often are torn down intentionally so that we don't get too much of a leg up. So we always have to learn and start from scratch. Customer service isn't learned overnight. Operations of a business, having that knowledge is not learned overnight. These things we have to grow at. And so I love seeing a new surge of my people supporting Black businesses. However, there is still many of us who will only support Black businesses to an extent. Is the Black-owned business supported by a big box store like Target? Oh, then I'll support it. But if I have to go online and order from them, it's a little bit too much. It costs too much, or I don't know if it's going to be good quality. I've heard all of these things. I've seen all of these things. And you know what? Let's be honest. You probably said it yourself. I've said it before, and I have to correct myself and teach myself, retrain myself that that's not the thought process that I want to have. And instead, I would prefer to put the money in my people's pockets so that the dollars circulated around in my neighborhood, but also so that I give them yet another opportunity to learn to do better. You can't do better without customers. It just doesn't happen like that. You can't learn better operations without having to operate. You can't learn how to do inventory better and have the appropriate amount of product if you don't have people coming back for you to get better. Now, on the flip side, folks, take it as a learning opportunity to do better. But that's not the point of the conversation. The point of the conversation is there is a lack of consistent support toward Black-owned businesses. And on top of that, we have a lot of internal crime. Every community does. However, the Black community and brown communities, they just love, and when I say they, I'm talking about the media, loves to say that this is Black-on-Black crime or brown-on-brown crime, but you don't hear that for our counterparts. Very frustrating. But at the end of the day, some of our internal crimes toward one another are very much so related to an economic type of mindset, an impoverished mindset and mentality. However, on the outside of that, there is some hate crimes toward one another that really stem from the history of how we have been trained as a people, how we have been trained to look at one another and interact with one another, to see one another. And it's very much so ingrained to a point where I don't even know we recognize that we've been encouraged to hate each other. And it's we've been encouraged to hate one another and to see the things that are not so great about each other instead of looking at it from a positive perspective. And lastly, there is another trend that I hate to have to say because it kind of makes me feel icky, is seeing certain people do things for personal gain. And oftentimes that personal gain is money. We've seen it in church, we've seen it in politics, we've seen it in business and other areas. But we've definitely seen it in those three different areas. And so it, again, perpetuates this idea of, you know what, I just cannot trust y'all, us, her. So the ultimate question is why? Small word, big question. Why? We see the history that contributed to it. But do we really see this? Can we really put a pin on the map? And one of the pins that I would put on the map is really coming from the training that was engraved into the slave driver. For those of you who don't know, the slave driver was oftentimes They were a slave, but they were somewhat of this liaison between the master or those who owned the slaves and the slaves, and they would, kind of keep the slaves in line. They worked for the master. They were their eyes and ears. They, held the slaves accountable to do the work, or if you ran away, they were sent out to go get that slave and bring them back to land. Yet they were a slave themselves. But again, it goes back to feeling like they had a little bit of notoriety. Maybe they were forced to do it. We don't talk about that often. Sometimes they did not have a choice. I mean, they likely did not have a choice. I'm talking like I was there. But they didn't have a choice. They were slaves themselves. But it perpetuated this idea that I really can't trust the people that I look like, because sometimes they turn on me, even when I'm attempting to get to safety, when I'm attempting to thrive and strive for things that are better for myself and for my family, when I am attempting to push against the grain or the system that I've been put into, that roller coaster system that I talked about in the previous week, that I can't trust us. And when that mentality has been set, that seed has been planted for years, centuries, over and over again, I think that we end up thinking about it and feeling that without actually always saying it. And it's an unhealthy mindset. It isn't helping us, and it's really not helping yourself. We've inherited this mindset. We've been taught this mindset. In fact, it has been reinforced. Think about it with when it comes to when we get a leader that's in the public. I had to think about it. When you get a leader that's in the public and they seem to be doing good for Black people, oftentimes media comes out with something to discredit that leader and put them in a light that says, you know what, you should not trust them because they are corrupt. They did it to Martin Luther King. They did it to Malcolm X. They're doing it to modern day leaders. We don't hear about it on a large scale in the same way, but it happens. Same tactics, different death. We're being taught to mistrust one another. And we've got to really do better at paying attention and recognizing all of the contributing factors that plays a major role in mind control. Honestly, my major question is, what are you doing, or what will you do to actively stop the message of, I can't trust us? What are you actively doing, or what will you actively do to end the message, don't trust Black skin? Hey y'all, quick announcement time. I know that this conversation was a bit heavy and thought-provoking, but if that is where it's landing, then it is doing what it's supposed to do. Excuse me, not an easy conversation to have, but a conversation that's very much so needed to have, because it is all contributed to mind control. And just to remind you all to continue the conversation and continue to stay connected with one another. Make sure that you're connecting with me on social media. All of the information is down in the description box and there at the bottom of the screen at Dr.Blaire on Instagram, Facebook, as well as Clubhouse. But I want you all to be thinking about this, and feel free to drop into one of my comments somewhere and let me know what this has made you think. What type of conversations have you had with others? I'd love to discuss it with you more. And also, if you are not at a place where you're ready to have the conversation publicly, have it privately. Share this with someone who can have this conversation with you, because we've really got to work on, since we're working on repairing the broken family, we also have to do that. And we can't do that without repairing the trust amongst one another, and that we have to deprogram ourselves to not automatically look at another person who looks like you, who shares similar skin as you, and think, boom, automatically you are not to be trusted, because it happens on a day-to-day basis, whether we acknowledge it or not. And so if you recognize that you've had those moments, how can you work on deprogramming and retraining yourself that Black people can be trusted? It's not a Black person thing, as much as there are some people who are not to be trusted and others who are. But we cannot continue to automatically think that about our people and treat one another in the way that others are treating us. We have to do better. Like, comment, subscribe, and share. Share with your community, and be sure to share with someone specific who needs to hear more about mistrust within the Black community. And of course, remember, before you go, and I'll see you next time, if I'm great and you're great, then we're a great community.